Welcome, confidential listeners, to a place where the past isn't just a memory, it's a prison sentence waiting to be served. Tonight, we find ourselves lost in the alleyways of Melbourne, a city of coffee, rain, and secrets buried beneath the rhythmic rattle of the tram tracks. This is Stephanie's archive, a woman who thought time had washed the blood from her hands, only to discover that fate has a wicked, twisted sense of humor. It is the diary of a love that bloomed in the wrong place at the wrong time with a man who was right, but whose brother was the ghost she couldn't outrun. Titled, I Met My Boyfriend's Brother and My Heart Stopped, a coincidence that killed tomorrow. So, bolt the door, ignore the cold wind blowing off the ocean, and listen closely, because the audience for this truth is only you. Melbourne in the winter is a city of shadows. I had spent 3 years building a wall around my heart, brick by painful brick. My last experience with love had left me as a hollow shell, and I promised myself that for the next 15 years, no man would ever get close enough to see the cracks. I started a new job in the CBD, and every day I'd sit alone in a small, dim cafe off Flinders Lane, hiding behind a book and a cup of bitter espresso. That's where I first noticed him. Mark. He worked nearby, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only person in the crowded room. He was persistent, but not aggressive, a gentle tide constantly hitting the rocks I'd built. It took months of polite refusals, months of me staring at the rain on the window pane, before I finally let him sit at my table. I didn't want him to be special. I wanted him to be just another face in the fog. But Mark had a smile that felt like the first day of spring after a long, dark winter. I thought I was safe because I had moved cities, changed my life, and buried my sins. I didn't realize that the man who was teaching me how to love again was the bridge back to the man who had taught me how to hate. We moved slow. I was a wounded animal, and Mark knew it. He didn't push for my history. He just wanted to build a future. 5 months in, he met my parents. I saw the way he looked at them, with respect, with the intention of a man who was playing for keeps. It terrified me and thrilled me at the same time. By the 8th-month mark, he started talking about his own family. My mom is dying to meet you, Steph, he'd say, laughing. He told me about his parents, his little sister, and his older brother who lived nearby with his wife and 2 kids. I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. I felt like the girl I was before the scandal, before the screaming in the street and the hands pulling at my hair. I felt clean. That Sunday, the sky over Melbourne was a bruised purple, a storm brewing in the distance. Mark drove us to his parents' house in the suburbs. As we pulled into the driveway, he pointed to a silver sedan parked out front. "Looks like my brother Joe is here too," he said, smiling. I felt a small chill, but I dismissed it as nerves. I didn't know that Joe was the name of the man who had ruined me. I didn't know that behind that front door, my past was waiting with a sharpened blade, ready to cut the throat of my new life. The drive to the suburbs was filled with Mark's excited chatter. He was proud of us, proud to finally bring me into the inner circle of his world. The sky over Melbourne was a bruised, heavy gray, the kind of afternoon where the light feels thin and old. Mark turned into a quiet street lined with neatly trimmed hedges and brick houses that looked like fortresses of domestic peace. As we pulled up to the driveway, he pointed to a silver sedan parked awkwardly near the curb. "Oh, brilliant! My brother Joe is here with the family. You'll finally get to meet the big brother I've been telling you about." I felt a sudden sharp prick of anxiety at the base of my neck. I told myself it was just nerves, the standard fear of not being liked by the perfect family. But as I stepped out of the car, the air felt strangely still, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the impact. We walked through the gate, and I could hear the muffled sounds of children laughing and shouting inside. It should have been a welcoming sound, but it felt like a warning siren. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through deep water. I looked at the silver car again, and a cold flash of recognition flickered in the back of my mind. A car I'd seen 100 times in a different life, in a different city. I shook it off. It couldn't be. The world isn't that cruel. But as Mark opened the front door, the smell of roast lamb and floor wax hit me, and I just knew that I was walking into my own execution. We stepped into the living room. Mark's father was sitting on the sofa, a newspaper folded on his lap, and next to him sat a man in a navy sweater. The man turned his head as we entered, a polite smile ready on his face. The smile didn't just fade, it died. It was Joe, or as I knew him back in the office 4 years ago. Joe. My legs gave way, and I had to grab Mark's arm just to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. Joe looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face turning the color of wet ash. Mark, completely oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in his living room, beamed at us. "Finally! Joe, this is Stephanie. Steph, this is my big brother Joe." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway like a hammer on an anvil. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We were two statues frozen in a moment of shared, dirty history. I wanted to run. I wanted to melt into the floorboards and vanish into the Melbourne sewers. Every memory of our desks side by side, the secret lunches, and the way he'd hidden his bare ring finger came rushing back like a tidal wave. I looked at him, the man who had cost me my job, my reputation, and my peace of mind, and realized he was Mark's blood. My refuge was actually the lion's den. "Mark, I have to go. I need to leave. Now." I tried to pull him toward the door, my voice cracking with terror I couldn't hide. But it was too late. The kitchen door swung open, and the 3 women of the house walked in. Mark's mother, his sister, and the woman who had once tried to tear the scalp from my head, Susan. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes locking onto mine, and I saw the recognition ignite like a match in a pool of gasoline. 4 years hadn't dimmed the fire in her eyes. She didn't see a guest. She saw the other woman who had come back to finish the job. The air in the room turned to glass, ready to shatter at the slightest sound. Mark's mother began to say something, a polite greeting, a welcome, but it was cut short by a sound that came from the depths of Susan's throat. It was a low, guttural hiss of pure, unadulterated hatred. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at me, her eyes boring into mine with the same lethal intensity she had that afternoon outside the office 4 years ago. Mark was frozen, his hand still on my waist, looking between his brother's pale face and his sister-in-law's trembling fury. "What's going on? Susan? Joe?" The silence broke with a crash. Susan stepped forward, her finger pointed at my chest like a loaded gun. "What is this trash doing in this house? Joe? Mark? Do you have any idea who this woman is? This is the whore who tried to dismantle my family. This is the girl from the office." I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins, a cold fire that made my skin prickle. The entire room was closing in on me. I saw Mark's father stand up, his face a mask of confusion and growing shame. I saw Joe staring at his shoes, a coward in his own home, unable to even look at the woman whose life he had helped ruin twice. I wasn't Stephanie the girlfriend anymore. I was back on that street corner, feeling her hands in my hair, hearing the laughter of strangers as I was beaten into the pavement. "I can't believe it. After all this time, you bring her into your mother's house? Is this a joke, Joe? Are you still seeing her?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Mark let go of my waist as if my skin had turned a hot coal. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw doubt, dark and ugly, clouding the eyes that at once looked at me with nothing but love. I didn't wait for Joe to explain. I didn't wait for Mark to ask the question I knew was coming. The shame was too heavy to carry in that small suburban room. I wrenched my hand away from Mark, spun around, and ran. I hit the front door so hard it swung back and cracked against the wall, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet street. I didn't look back at the silver sedan. I didn't look back at the house that was supposed to be my future. I hit the pavement running. The Melbourne sky finally broke, and a cold, biting rain began to pour, soaking through my thin blouse in seconds. I could hear Mark behind me, his voice echoing off the brick houses, calling my name with a mix of desperation and anger. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned like they were filled with acid, my heels clicking frantically against the wet asphalt. I wasn't just running from Mark. I was running from the eyes of a family that would never see me as anything but a predator. I reached the main road, the tram tracks shimmering like silver snakes in the rain. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a plan. I just had the taste of copper in my mouth and the realization that the past is a debt you can never fully pay off. Mark's voice grew distant, swallowed by the sound of the traffic in the downpour. I climbed onto a passing tram, my body shaking with the cold that went deeper than my skin. I sat in the back, watching the suburbs of Melbourne blur into a gray smudge through the fogged-up glass, knowing that the man I loved was currently hearing the true version of me, the version Susan had kept polished and sharp for 4 long years. I pulled my phone from my pocket and saw 5 missed calls from Mark. I turned it off. The engine of my new life hadn't just stalled, it had exploded, leaving me stranded in the rain with nothing but the ghost of Joe's pale face and the sting of Susan's words echoing in my ears. 2 days passed in a blur of gray light and silence. I stayed in my apartment, watching the rain streak the windows of my Carlton flat, waiting for the final blow. It came on Tuesday night. A knock at the door, not the frantic pounding of a lover, but the heavy, hesitant thud of a man who already knew the answer. I opened it to find Mark. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Sunday roast. His eyes, once so bright and full of a future for us, were now sunken and shadowed, filled with a weary disappointment that hurt worse than Susan's screams. He didn't come in at first. He just stood in the hallway, the smell of damp wool and old sorrow clinging to him. She told us everything, Steph. My mother, my father, Joe, especially Joe. He finally looked at me, and I saw the ghost of the man I loved disappearing before my eyes. Is it true? Were you the woman from the office? The one who almost ended his marriage? I didn't lie. What was the point? The past had already burned the house down. There was no use trying to save the furniture. I sat him down, and I told him the whole sordid, pathetic truth. I told him how Joe had hidden his ring, how I had looked for an alliance on his finger and found only skin. I told him about the charm, the manipulation, and the day Susan caught us, the day I became a public spectacle. I didn't add a comma, and I didn't take away a period. I laid it all out like an autopsy report on a dead dream. I didn't know he was your brother, Mark. I didn't even know he existed in your world. To me, he was just a mistake I was trying to outrun. Mark stared at the floorboards, his jaw tight. He wasn't just hearing about a scandal. He was realizing that the woman he wanted to marry was the same woman his family had spent 4 years whispering about in hushed, hateful tones. The silence in my apartment was suffocating. Mark stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights of Melbourne reflecting off the wet pavement. My parents, they won't even say your name now. My mother is heartbroken, and Susan, she told everyone. The whole family knows. He turned back to me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the old Mark, but it was quickly replaced by a wall of ice. How are we supposed to have a Sunday lunch, Steph? How am I supposed to look at my brother over the table, knowing you, knowing what happened? I saw it then. The charm, the spell of our love wasn't just cracked, it was pulverized. Mark wasn't looking at the woman who made him laugh at Flinders Lane. He was looking at a complication. He was looking at the other woman who had brought shame to his bloodline. I realized that in a war between love and family loyalty, I was always going to be the casualty. Mark was a good man, a loyal man, and that was exactly why he couldn't stay. Every time he kissed me, he'd taste Joe's lies. Every time we went to a family wedding or a Christmas dinner, I'd be the ghost at the table, the one Susan would never stop watching. You should go, Mark. If you stay, you'll just grow to hate me for making you choose. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me it didn't matter. He just closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the exhaustion on his face. I'm sorry. I really thought you were the one. He walked out of my flat, and the sound of my door clicking shut felt like the lid of a casket being sealed. I stood in the middle of my room, surrounded by the shadows of a life that was never going to happen, realizing that Joe had managed to take everything from me twice, once with his touch and once with his blood. The days following Mark's departure were a slow descent into a silence I had known since the first scandal. Melbourne continued to move outside my window. The trams rattled, the coffee machines hissed in the cafes below, and the crowds blurred into a faceless mass on the sidewalk. But inside my flat, the air felt thin, like it belonged to a different decade. I found myself standing in front of the mirror, searching for the villain Susan had described. I saw the same eyes, the same hair, but the woman looking back was a stranger. I had spent years trying to wash the scent of Joe's deception off my skin, only to find that it had been tattooed into my DNA by a twist of fate I could never have predicted. Every time I thought about Mark, I didn't see his smile anymore. I saw the way his face had hardened into an icy mask of disgust when he looked at me for the last time. Joe had won. Even in his cowardice, even in his silence, as he sat on that sofa watching me drown, he had won. He kept his family, his house, and his reputation, while I was left with the ruins of a second chance. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in my chest, a dull, constant ache that no amount of Melbourne rain could ever wash away. I was the one who had to leave the job, the one who had to hide, and now I was the one who had to spend my nights wondering why the universe decided to play such a cruel, calculated joke on my heart. I didn't stay in Carlton. I couldn't walk past the places where Mark and I had imagined a future without feeling like I was stepping on broken glass. I packed my life into boxes for the third time in 5 years. As I took down the curtains, I looked over at the empty space where Mark's photos used to be, shadows on the wall that were the only things left of the man who almost saved me. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the family had closed ranks. Susan had successfully played the martyr, Joe was the misled husband, and I was the ghost story they told to keep their bonds tight. I realized that some loves aren't meant to be saved. They are just lessons wrapped in a tragedy. Mark and I tried to glue the shards back together for a week, but the cracks were too deep, the history too bloody. In the end, he didn't leave because he didn't love me. He left because he couldn't live with the man I had been with before him. The brotherhood was a wall I couldn't climb, and the past was a poison that had already reached the well. I drove out of Melbourne as the sun was setting, a brilliant, mocking orange bleeding across the horizon. I was 33, alone again, and moving toward a city where I hoped the name Joe was just a name and not a death sentence. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time at the skyline, knowing that the only thing I was taking with me was the heavy, cold realization that some coincidences aren't accidents. They are executions. And so the archive closes on Stephanie and Mark, a story of a love that was murdered by a bloodline and buried by a Sunday roast. A reminder that in the neon-lit streets of Melbourne, the person you are running toward might be the very one who leads you back to the person you are trying to escape. If this journey through the shadows of an Australian tragedy has touched you, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Help us continue to unbox these heavy truths from the Secrets inbox. Click the bell icon so you never miss a heartbeat when the next secret is revealed. But tell me, confidential listeners, was Mark right to protect his family's peace, or did he throw away the love of his life for a brother who didn't deserve his loyalty? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because in a world this small, the only way to truly escape your past is to never look back. Until next time, stay safe and keep your secrets close. Good night.